The New Testament is very pro-Roman. The Romans are off the hook completely for this. That's why the Jews have to be characterized that way. It's an explanation of why don't the Jews believe in Jesus? Oh, they're evil. They're enemies of God. I see. Okay, now I understand.
Hi, this is Brave New History. We're here with Rabbi Tovia Singer. Yeah, a rabbi that reaches out to missionaries, right? And Jews may be thinking about converting to Christianity.
Yeah, I help Jewish people who are in the church considering converting to Christianity, help them return back to the Jewish faith, and moreover, Christians who are engaged in evangelizing Jews level some very serious charges against the Jewish faith. They're questions that deserve to be answered, and I devote my life to addressing those important questions.
So what are your thoughts on Christian origins? Do you think it really came from Judaism, or is it more like a Greek invention? Or what do you suppose is going on?
Christianity is the most highly variegated religion in the world. So many expressions of the Christian religion where they disagree on fundamental doctrines. Moreover, if you think that the Christianity that we observe today is diverse, in the ancient world, in the early church, it was even more diverse. So there were expressions of Christianity which did not survive. Ebionites, Nazarenes, the church fathers tell us about that. Their writings don't survive. But largely what you have are pagan ideas that are using or misappropriating Jewish symbols, vague concepts. Central figure in Christianity is Jesus, who it is claimed is the Messiah. So that's a Jewish term, Mashiach. But there's no relationship between what the Hebrew Bible says about the Messiah and what Christians say about Jesus. The Messiah is not supposed to die. In fact, much of the New Testament addresses the conundrum of why didn't Jesus do anything that anyone expected. He's not supposed to die for anybody's sins. Rather, he's going to teach the world, transform the world. But in the Christian view, he's one of the many deities in their view of a triune Godhead that acts as an intermediary between God and man. In fact, Paul sums that up in 1 Timothy 2:5. There is God, and there's man, and there's one mediator between the two, and that's Jesus Christ. So he's a God-man who is able to intervene in a theological scheme where the Father is essentially inaccessible. The Father is just so amazingly righteous, and he's so up there that who could speak to the creator of the planets? This is the way the Greco-Roman world thought. Zeus was inaccessible. Jupiter was inaccessible, and people didn't pray to them. They were too busy. But you had these lower-tier gods, and that's where Jesus falls in the henotheistic, Neoplatonic religion that simply took the ideas that were well-known beyond the Greco-Roman world in North Africa and then interpolate them into a faint Jewish sketch using Jewish symbols, Jewish terms, and that's the religion that became so successful throughout the empire.
Do you suppose it came from less than orthodox forms of Judaism, like with Philo?
Yes, very much so. It's very important for your viewers to understand that Philo wasn't just less orthodox. That's like saying that astrology is a little less orthodox than astronomy. It's not only less orthodox, it's off the charts. It has nothing to do with Judaism. Philo, his name was Chaim, was born in the year 20 BCE. He died in the 50s. So he lived right through the the whole Christian period. He was a contemporary. Of course, he didn't write a word about Jesus, but Philo's idea of the Logos, a transcendent deity that was not the ultimate great God, but it was a demiurge. It was kind of the god of the physical world that was in between. That's all Neoplatonic ideas. And these were not crazy people. They were completely logical. We live in the modern, we know so much. We know that everything we encounter is made up of the same elements, of the same stuff, that you and your dog share 98% of your DNA in common. The ancient world, they didn't understand any of these things. So they saw the planets and were amazed by the perfection of the symmetry and their movements and their predictability. And then they looked around them and they saw death. Imagine a world where there's no modern medicine. Would you be alive today if modern medicine, antibiotics didn't exist? Many people would say I'd probably be dead by now, right? So people just died suddenly, inexplicably. This world seemed to be a broken place, a place that was inexplicably damaged. It was thought that there's the great deity that governs the celestial bodies, and then there's this lesser god or this terrestrial deity that governed this world. That was very much the Neoplatonic view. They were just completely incompatible, and they were really rational actors. They were not. The only thing is, it wasn't Jewish. The Jewish idea was so radical, was so outrageous to the ancient world, that there is one God, and He governs everything, and everything is from Him, and you can talk to Him. He loves you, and He just wants a relationship with you. That was outrageous to the ancient world. The Greco, both in the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, Jews were respected for a variety of reasons, but they couldn't wrap their head around this. Like the eternal God, which they all believed in, can talk to you, that was just, they couldn't imagine such an idea. So, yeah, this is all Neoplatonic. The idea that comes into view in John chapter 1, the prologue from verse 1 through 18, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. All that is all Philo of Alexandria. There's a Jewish saying, which I invented, but could anything good come from Alexandria? So every iteration of idolatry, all the way through the doctrine of the Trinity, was all emerged from North Africa. The thinkers who were the interlocutors at the Council of Nicaea were all from Alexandria. Its bishop, its deacon, they were all the people who advocated for the doctrine of the Trinity. So the Philo, who visited Israel frequently, his ideas were the ideas that had such a persuasive effect on the way early Christians thought.
So do you think Paul, do you think he was actually a Pharisee?
No. The term Pharisee is an anachronism, and it just means an Orthodox Jew. The term Orthodox Jew was just coined a couple of centuries ago. But they are the same thing. So just like today, if you want to talk about Jews who are very serious, you talk about Orthodox Jews, right? And no matter where you're coming from, whether you believe in it or don't believe it, you oppose it, you like it, whatever it is, but the Orthodox Jew, that's the gold standard. So that's what the Pharisees are. Paul's ideas emerge out of the Greco-Roman world, are Neoplatonic. Paul's idea of the rapture in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the idea that the believers are all sucked into the heavens and God deals judgment on this earth. More importantly, his notion of the resurrection of the dead in 1 Corinthians 15, probably his most famous chapter, in where he states unambiguously that Jesus rose from the dead. Of course, he's the first fruits of the resurrection, for sure. But whatever resurrected is not the mortal body that died. It's something new and spiritual. There's a resurrection. That's what the Greeks thought. The Jews didn't think that at all. They believe and to this day, it's a core tenet of our faith, of a physical resurrection from the dead. Now, you may think, well, this seems trivial. That was the big thing that the ancient world could not get. The Greeks and the Romans just could not understand why Jews would ever want to return back to the wretched body. Remember how they thought about it. So they all believed in an afterlife, but it was a spiritual afterlife. So that goes right through 1 Corinthians 15. It's almost certainly the reason why Paul never mentions an empty tomb. He never mentions an empty tomb because Jesus could have resurrected without the tomb being empty. Because what resurrects is not the corpse. Follow? This is an interesting area. So Paul leaves out the empty tomb, but the empty tomb is very prominent in the Gospels. Paul's letters date to the 50s. The Gospels are written between 70 and 95, right? So it's a considerable amount of time later. And in the ancient world, 30, 40, 50 years was an enormous amount of time. People generally didn't even live that long. So the church on that one issue is going to turn the corner and return back to Judaism on that and say, no, Jesus really was a physical resurrection. That's going to be advanced, by the Gospels, especially in Luke 24. Especially at the end of John, where Thomas is touching the flesh of Jesus. They're pushing back. That's an apologetic. So Paul's ideas are utterly comfortable in Tarsus, a place of Western philosophical reflection, not Jerusalem at all. Paul claiming to be a Pharisee is the claim you would need to make if you wanted any credibility at all. That was the standard. In the New Testament, which is hostile to Jews, New Testament characterizes the Jews unfavorably. Those who are not Christians, they don't come off well. And nevertheless, the Christian Bible says the Pharisees and scribes sit in the seat of Moses, right? The oracles of God were given to the Jews, Romans chapter 3. So unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you can't enter heaven. That's the Sermon on the Mount. So that's the gold standard. So Paul is going to be advancing repeatedly why his authority is greater than others. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees from the tribe of Benjamin. He has it directly from Jesus Christ. He didn't get anything from Jerusalem. This is what the first 2 chapters of Galatians are about, Philippians 3. Paul is always advancing his credentials against who? Fellow Christians who disagreed with his views. So Paul was always saying that, look, I come from a Pharisaic background. There was no one who was more zealous for the Lord than me. Basically, he is saying, I'm the smartest guy in the class. Paul doesn't claim to be a student of Gamaliel in his own letters. The book of Acts makes that claim. That would have been outrageous. Paul could never pull that off in his own writings because Gamaliel would have been alive at the time. That would be very easy to check. So Paul is claiming to be a Pharisee, but there's no relationship with what he teaches and Pharisaic ideas, let alone writing in Greek. Paul persecuting Christians, that would have been a very strange thing to do. In fact, in the book of Acts, Gamaliel says, don't persecute Christians. Let alone what authority would Paul have had over Christians in Damascus. The whole story doesn't make sense. So no, Paul was not a Pharisee. He was like today. People who are not Jewish or not Orthodox know a lot about Judaism, know a lot about Orthodox Jews. Right? We were a group whose influence was considerable given our small numbers. But Judaism is a very, very important religion, and therefore people were very familiar with Jewish texts. So Paul was no Pharisee.
Yeah. So you'd say he's fibbing.
Oh, yeah. He was just very Greek. Maybe a point for the viewers. So Greek wasn't just like another language. It's not like today someone writes in Spanish. or Portuguese. That wouldn't mean anything. What does that convey? Nothing. Greek was the enemy culture to the Jews. The story of Hanukkah had just occurred 2 centuries earlier, not even 2 centuries earlier. So Greek thought, influence, power was all antithetical to religious Jews. Religious Jews saw anything Greek as the enemy. Religious Jews didn't write in Greek. They spoke in Aramaic. They would have written in Aramaic, would have written in Hebrew, but Greek was immediately a red flag for something very dangerous. People who had ideas that were thoroughly opposed by the Hebrew Bible. So don't think of Greek as just another language or the lingua franca of the time. Because you have to transport yourself to the Jewish world, to the Jewish mind. Greek was the enemy philosophy, idea. Everything Greek was very bad for Jewish people.
We have Christianity with the Greek thought, and then it claims origins from Judaism. You think that's where the whole anti-Semitism comes from, or Gnosticism is kind of the self-realization?
The anti-Semitism comes directly from the Christian Bible, because the Christian Bible is just extremely hostile to Jews. And there may be someone watching me right now who thinks maybe this rabbi just has an unfavorable view of Christianity, and I'm characterizing it in a way that's uncharitable. Well, if anyone just opens up the Gospels, which are stories, not like Paul Wood's theology, the Jews are in almost every story, and the Jews are doing just the worst possible thing in the world. And not only that, it's not just the Jews are wrong in the Gospels. The Jews are the enemies of God, and they're called the children of the devil in John 8:44. And while Gentiles may not get it, Pontius Pilate was perhaps flawed. He and his wife in Matthew 27 correctly recognized Jesus as completely innocent, while the Jews are screaming, "Crucify him," and we take his blood upon ourselves and our children. Oh, every single story, it will be the kind of thing you would read in pamphlets published by the Klan about Jews, that the Jews control everything. That's where it all comes from. The Jews control the world. We control Hollywood. We control the media. That whole idea that Jews are a pernicious, demonic people who control the world, who have power far exceeding their numbers. There must be some conspiracy. The Jews are the enemy. That caricature of the Jew that controls the world. You know, Shakespeare never met a Jew in his life because the Jews had been expelled from England when Shakespeare was alive in the 16th and early 17th century. But he produced The Merchant of Venice in 1599, wrote it about a Jew with a very important Jewish character that was not flattering. Where did he get that from? Not from meeting Jews, from just how Jews are portrayed. That's thoroughly Christian. It's thoroughly the God. The Jews are just trying to stop Jesus at every corner, at every turn, and they're doing it for no good reason. They're just nasty. It's not like they misunderstand. They know the truth but reject Christ anyway. They're bribing Roman soldiers. They're just the worst. The Roman centurion, in contrast, is going that Jesus really is the Son of God. That's how the book of Mark ends. So that's where anti-Semitism emerges from. It emerges from storytelling. That's how bigotry is created. People become bigots or hate whatever group, not because they're told dogmatically this group is bad. The reason why people are bigoted is because they're told stories about a certain group. They are not told similar stories about a different group, and those stories are the vehicle with which the hatred and caricature of any group is created. Well, that's what the Gospels do. At every turn, the Jews are the ones who are the enemies of Christ, plotting against him.
Yeah, that's a good point that I've never thought of as the Gospels portray the Jews as controlling Rome, right?
Sure.
On the decision to crucified Jesus. And that's a good parallel to the whole conspiracy theories, right?
Pontius Pilate is calling for the exoneration of Jesus. He washes his hands of this, says, I see nothing guilty in him. And the Jews are screaming, crucify him. And Pontius Pilate is told directly by Jesus, we're told. It's a story that we only find in John's Passion narrative, where Jesus actually says, you didn't do anything wrong. It's the ones that gave me over to you, to their sin. It's very, very clear. The Jews, Paul says this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14 through 16. He says, and even as they have of the Jews who both killed the Lord Jesus Christ and their own prophets, are contrary to mankind, they're the enemy of everything. And one other point, the New Testament is very pro-Roman. The Romans are off the hook completely for this. And Paul really holds of the empire. In Romans chapter 13, Paul encourages people to be loyal to the empire, not because it's practical, it's pragmatic, you don't want to get killed. No, Paul's argument is that God put the Roman Empire in place. That's part of his plan. He wants them there. And therefore you should be dutiful and lawful and respectful. People don't realize how pro-Roman the New Testament is and how viciously anti-Semitic it is. The Romans can't do anything wrong. They make mistakes, but they don't know any better. The Jews are behind every evil thing in the world.
And it's without any kind of rationale behind it? Like, why would they need to portray Jews like that? Like, how does that benefit them?
There's a fundamental problem that Christians have to deal with, not just today, but throughout its history. One of the most frequently asked questions that Christians pose. And that is they ask, why don't the Jews believe in Christ? Why don't the Jews believe this? You have to understand, the church is claiming that the truth and proof of Christianity can be demonstrated from the Old Testament. It's right there. And it says that in the New Testament. If you would have believed in Moses, you would have believed in me, because he wrote about me in John 5:46, 2 Timothy 3:16, Luke 24:44. It's really all over the place. So the big question, really, like the truth of Christianity, its veracity can be demonstrated from the Hebrew Bible, and that's the foundation of truth. Well, what do the Jews say about you? Like, what do the Jews say about your religion? Oh, the Jews believe that Jesus is not the Messiah. Really, the Jews have a reputation of being fairly smart. Like, why don't they believe in it? They're the only ones who can read the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, in its original language. No one else reads Hebrew. Like, only the Jews read it. They were expecting the Messiah. More importantly, they were in the land of Israel when this whole thing went down, when these putative events went down. Like, why weren't they impressed? This is not like saying the Chinese don't believe in Jesus. It doesn't make a difference what the Chinese think. They don't have a concept of the Messiah. They never did. They weren't there. The Jews were there. And the Jews have a reputation for their intelligence. Like, it's their Bible. It's their hope. It's their dream. It's their core tenet. Therefore, how do you explain away why Jews don't believe this? Why Jews don't find this persuasive? You have to explain that. Well, you could say to your parishioners, well, the Jews don't believe in Jesus. I'll tell you why. Because they look at the Bible and they view it differently. You know what that would do? People go, why do they view it differently? They can't do that because that completely discredits it. Like the Jews, like, why don't they? This is what is bothersome. So what you have to do is you have to say there's some supernatural reason why the Jews don't believe this, because they're the ones who are supposed to believe this. So you'd have to say that the Jews, there's some conspiracy. The Jews are just enemies. They deliberately don't do it. The Jews are just the enemies of Christ, as I mentioned in John chapter 8. You've got to explain away why it is the hideous nature of the Jew to deny Christ. And that's what you find, like the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a nightmare of a story. It's about how the Jews behave so badly, but yet the Samaritan, who's not Jewish, is so kind and thoughtful. That's the whole story. The whole story is just a nightmare. That's why the Jews have to be characterized that way. It's a polemic. It's an explanation of why don't the Jews believe in Jesus? Oh, they're evil. They're enemies of God. I see. Okay, now I understand.